Hello. Thanks for coming this session early this morning. And I'm Jung-wook Lim, Managing Director of the Startup Alliance. I'm so glad to have this wonderful session this morning. And I prepared my own kind of, some several questions. And I'm first going to ask, several questions, and after that, going to receive, your audience's questions. So please, if you have any questions, and please give that upload to the DEF2019 simplo.com. So I'm kind of wondering that how many of you actually attended yesterday's Christine's keynote and also Bukalapk's and Fajrin's keynote speech. Would you please raise your hand if you listened that session yesterday? Okay, so probably less than half. So I want to ask you guys first, in order to let them understand what you guys doing, and make the quick intro about yourself and your organizations. And Christine, you first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Tsai. I'm the CEO and founding partner of 500 Startups. I'm based in Silicon Valley, as is 500. Our headquarters is actually technically San Francisco, but we are a global venture capital firm that focuses primarily on early stage companies, but we do a lot more than just writing a check. We really believe in building sustainable ecosystems around the world, and we also have, from the very beginning, believed that entrepreneurship is global. So in addition to investing in companies early stage, we also do a lot to help contribute to building ecosystems in terms of education, working with investors, corporates, governments, stakeholders around the world. To date, 9 years in, our portfolio is about actually 50% from outside of the US. We have about 16 unicorns that we can publicly mention, of which almost half are also out from outside the US, including Bukalapk.
Okay, thanks. You?
Hi everyone, my name is Fajrin. I'm one of the co-founders and also the president of Bukalapk. Bukalapk is one of the unicorns in Indonesia. As mentioned by Christine, also invested by 500 startups. We started around 2010 by creating something similar to Amazon or Alibaba, which is an e-commerce marketplace platform in Indonesia, with a vision to empower Indonesian SMEs so that they're able to prosper through online by selling things in the platform. But recently in 2017, we expanded from online into offline spaces as well, partnering with over 1 million of traditional retailers, so small kiosks, mom and pop stores, making ourselves an integrated commerce. So from e-commerce, we sort of like taking the E out of e-commerce to become like integrated commerce company using technology with a vision to empower Indonesian SMEs.
Mm-hmm. So, Christine, I have further questions about your unicorn companies and your portfolio companies. So it seems that you have been invested over 2,300 some companies. So so you've been starting investing from the 2010, right? 2010. So which means that you're making more than 200 startups a year. So that's a kind of overwhelming, some number of the startups. How you are able to do that? I kind of how you able to identify good startups and making some investment, and how many of you, and how big is your team around the world, and can you talking about more specifics?
Yeah, definitely. So to answer the last question, because that's probably the quickest one. So our team around the world is about 120 around the world, across probably 20 countries. In terms of our portfolio, so because we focus primarily on seed stage, and that term has changed a bit. So you hear terms like pre-seed, or I don't know, but essentially kind of pre-institutional round. Our thesis from the very beginning was that it is very challenging to identify who's going to be a winner at that stage, because when you're talking about a small team, you know, maybe primarily founders, they have a product, they might have some traction or maybe not. You don't have too much to go off of. So we have vetted and refined our criteria over the last 9 years in terms of what we look for in companies, but also a combination that we know that it's challenging to pick that early. So our thesis has largely been we will invest in a large number of companies, and knowing that the failure rate will be high, and then we try to double down where the companies, we see promise in the companies after maybe working with them for a few months. So criteria at that stage, to put it in kind of very at a high level, we definitely, most important thing for us is the team and the founders. We like to invest in companies that are more capital efficient. So something that takes a lot of capital, maybe certain types of hardware products, it's not really our expertise. So we're primarily investing in tech, usually software-based. But nowadays that line kind of blurs a little bit. So there's a lot of companies that maybe don't seem like core technology companies, but they're tech-enabled. So we look at that in terms of the industry and what's the addressable market. And we do like to invest in companies also that have more scalable distribution channels. So while we do quite a bit of B2B SaaS enterprise, which is much more sales-driven, you know, we do also like to invest in companies that can get to scale kind of through online channels. But there's a lot of other things that we look at, but those are sort of some of the primary things.
Do you also running accelerator program in the San Francisco? How many some companies apply for that each batch, and how many companies do you accept?
We've been running our flagships accelerator program in San Francisco, or I guess previously it was in kind of further south. But for those who maybe aren't aware, like nowadays when you talk about Silicon Valley, especially as it relates to startups and venture capital, now the center of gravity is really San Francisco. But in any case, so we have been running the accelerator program from the very beginning. It is very intertwined with our funds. So we invest in all the companies. It is kind of a channel for deal flow for us. We are now on our 26th batch. And increasingly, the acceptance rate is lower and lower because there's a lot of demand when companies apply. So there's probably thousands and thousands of applications for every cohort, and we accept roughly around, on average, 30 companies per cycle.
30 companies, okay. So Fajrin, I'd like to ask you about your background first. So I heard that you actually studied in Korea before started company. And so can you explain a little bit about it? Why did you study in Korea, and what did you study, and what did you learn?
Right, so I had undergraduate studies in Indonesia, in computer science it's called Institute of Technology Bandung in Indonesia. And in 2008, there is this exchange program, so student exchange program from Indonesia and some other countries in Southeast Asia to Korea. And so it's part of the Asian and Korea exchange student program or something like that. And I applied, and then I got accepted. So I studied in 2008 in Daejeon, in this university called Daejeon University, or Daejeon Daehakgyo. And the first thing I studied was actually how to buy online. So because before I studied in Korea, back in Indonesia, there was no online shopping, very limited. We only used internet for browsing, maybe social media and stuff like that. When I came to Korea in 2008, I watched my Korean friends actually order online through Gmarket, Interpark, and some other website, I forgot. And the goods arrived into the dorms, right? I was excited. I tried using my friend's account because I don't have a Korean bank account and so at that time. So it's actually one of the things that inspired me, right? Because in Indonesia, again, at the time, 2008, 2009, there was no e-commerce platform, so to say. At the time, there was only a classified platforms where it's like an e-commerce. You can post something there. You can offer some things to sell to your visitors, but there is no payment system and stuff like that. So if you want to buy something that is posted there, then you just contact the sellers directly, and then the transaction happens offline. But seeing what happened in Korea at the time, and obviously we also learned about what happened globally in the US with Amazon and so on, in China with Alibaba and so on, we thought that something similar with that can actually be implemented here in Indonesia. So that is actually one thing that inspired me to start at Bukalapk in 2010.
So studying in Korea was your inspiration, one of your inspirations to start business in Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's why I always considered Korea to be like sort of like special, and that's why when I was invited here as well, I'm actually glad to see what's changed after that, right, from 2008 into now.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So, Christine, I also want to ask you background, and probably many people, assume that you're, maybe Chinese or Taiwanese, given your last name. But I heard that you're, some Korean, and so can you explain a little bit about how you started, some 500 startups actually, and what was your experience before you start, some 500 startups? What makes you do that?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the U.S. As you said, that I'm by heritage, my family is Korean. My Korean is not so good, so but I can understand most, like, very basic level. But if I cannot talk business in Korean, so. But I am born and raised in the U.S., and I actually, majority of my childhood and even to this day was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and very specifically quite close to Silicon Valley. So as a child, most of my exposure to technology was really through my mom, because she worked in Silicon Valley as an engineer. So technology was always in our house. It was always something that was very, I had the fortune of being exposed to it, and definitely encouraged, or strongly encouraged, to take up in terms of computer science and coding. And I went to college at UC Berkeley, and I had wanted to I always saw that I wanted to have some sort of career in technology. Around the time that I graduated, of course, though, it was not the best time. So I definitely remember that experience of kind of the rise of the internet and kind of the dot-com
So you
bubble
graduated
and burst.
2003, 2002,
2002, so that was not a good time.
I also graduated 2002.
Yeah, so definitely a very, very tough time. But one of the few companies at that time, one of the small companies that was hiring was Google. So working
was
kind
it
of at a
small company at the time?
I mean, I think now, compared to where it is now, it was small. At that time, it was, like, when I joined Google, it was probably maybe 800 people. So it was definitely not small, but it felt quite small. So, I felt quite fortunate that I joined Google when I did, in terms of really being part of a very, very transformative time in Silicon Valley, as well as for Google itself. Now, Google's a very big company, and there's been quite a bit of, they've been through the ringer, I think, in terms of
But when you graduate, I assume that there's probably other choices, like the Intel or other Apple, other maybe bigger companies. And why did you choose to go to Google, a little bit unknown company, to the Silicon Valley people at the time?
Yeah, I think for me it was specifically within technology. I was interested in the internet. So, or the World Wide Web. I had actually wanted to be a web developer and web designer. So I remember being very fascinated by that technology. Obviously, like Apple, Intel weren't necessarily in that space. So to me, Google was very fascinating. But during that time, in addition to being able to work on a lot of really kind of groundbreaking products at the time, I also got a lot more exposure to developers, and many of those developers were really startup entrepreneurs. So that's where I kind of piqued my interest in working with startups. And then 2010, I left Google to help get started what is now 500.
So Fajrin, so I'd like to ask you about how did you start the company? when after coming back from Korea, and how did you met your co-founders? And it's probably at the time, 2010, the same time, and there are probably not that much, some startup in Indonesia, and I also probably assume that not that many people actually use the internet and other things. And what actually brought you start the company?
Yeah, so I returned from Korea to Indonesia in early 2009 and then graduated not long after that. And I, together with two of my friends back in college, Zaki and Nugroho, so three of us were graduated from computer science, and we thought of developing a business together, right? And when we brainstormed what kind of business do we want to build, and e-commerce is one of the ideas that we want to develop. But then I think we think at a time we also need to tailor or adjust to the local markets, right? We think that just developing e-commerce might not work. So, for example, in the US, I assume that majority or almost everyone has credit cards, and not in Indonesia. People who have credit cards is still very small. Even until now, maybe there is only 5% of population who has credit cards.
Even now?
Even
5%.
now. I think so, yeah, 5%, definitely less than 10%. So in that matters, then when we create a payment system, we need to adjust, right? Yes, we can offer credit card, but we also need to offer other type of payment services. So that is one thing that we need to adjust. The second thing is, what is the situation regarding the merchants in Indonesia? In Indonesia, majority of merchants, majority of business are SMEs. That is why we created an e-commerce marketplace, not a first-party online retailers. Online retailers means that you actually sell your own things. You have a warehouse and stuff like that where you source the good from some suppliers, and then you sell using your own account. But we instead provide a marketplace because Indonesia is very big, very well-spread countries, and there is a lot of goods from certain different areas, We have about 17,000 islands. So there is goods that is only specific in one island, and different provinces create different things. So we think that maybe it's better to create marketplace instead, because with that, we will have a lot of suppliers, right? And that is why until now, in 2019, we have over 5 million merchants, because as a marketplace, we're able to attract many, many suppliers, and as a result, the price is also competitive, right? Meaning that when you find something in Bukalapk, there will be a lot of merchants offering similar products. In return, the price will be competitive.
It seems that building your product, in the beginning was a really challenge. And I also wondering that probably at the time, not that many people, many startups in Indonesia, and people have no idea how to get the funding, from the investors. Probably people don't even know that what the venture capital is. So how did you get funded? How did you meet 500 startup,
Yeah, so you're correct. In 2010, there was no, startup communities in Indonesia. There was even no term startup. There is no VC. There is no unicorn startups term. There was only, a technology company, IT company, tech company, and investors in general. So yes, when we first started in 2010, when we tried to raise funds, it was not easy, and people didn't really understand that, it can be potentially big and something like that. So I think that is why the reason startups at the time try to do a bootstrapping, meaning they try to grow by their own money, to show that this is actually potential to grow fast. Only in 2011, end of 2011, we got the first seed investors at a time from this venture capital called Batavia. And then Batavia in 2012, around 2012, met Kylie, which is one of the partner of Christine's in 500 startups. And in 2013, 500 startups also invested in us. And I think during that time, 2012, 2013, only then Indonesian startups community started to appear. More and more people started to see this industry as a potential industry to focus on, whether to be a startup, to develop startup, or to be a VC, to invest in the startups.
Christine, so do you have any kind of some experience or something like that, or, you know, with regarding investing in Bukalapk and that kind of some opportunity to invest in Southeast Asian, you know, startups?
Right. So, you know, from when we first started 500, you know, big part of both our investment thesis as well as the mission of the company was that talent was all around the world, and we felt like some of the next big companies would not be from Silicon Valley, and actually maybe not even from outside, or sorry, not even from the US. So at the time, that was a very contrarian view. I remember a lot of skepticism. To invest outside of Silicon Valley, even investing in LA or New York was a little bit questionable. So to invest outside of the US was almost unheard of in terms of, you know, what kind of companies are there? There's no downstream capital, there's no liquidity. But regardless, we planted those seeds early on. Southeast Asia is a great example in terms of us starting to make investments there probably around, you know, like 2012, 2013. We also launched a dedicated fund for Southeast Asia called 500 Durians, which is run by one of my partners, Kylie and Vishal. But I think that's an example of our strategy in terms of having people on the ground with regional funds that are dedicated to that market, and how they work with how they all kind of work together is there's a lot of deal flow that gets shared. So with Bukalapk, kind of under the hood, the Southeast Asia Fund invested, but so did the Global Fund, and we found that really through that partner in that fund, and so we have seen a lot of opportunity and a lot of success coming out of Southeast Asia, and we see this also happening in many markets around the world, in the Middle East, Latin America, you know, obviously East Asia, and particularly Korea as well.
Mm-hmm. You said you have 16 unicorn startups, and among half of them is outside the US, right?
Close to half,
yeah. Yeah. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Where are they?
So some of the unicorn companies that are outside of the US, so obviously Bukalapk is one, Grab is another, a company called Canva, which is Australia.
Yeah.
I always, every time I try to name all of them, but
how about Latin America or Europe, Middle East? Not that.
So Middle East and Latin America are not quite yet. I think those are still markets that are, there are unicorns, you know, some unicorns that have come out of that market, but we are still early there. But a lot of the unicorns that we've seen are primarily kind of Southeast Asia. There's, I think, a couple in Europe, and then obviously Canva. But I think it's only going to be a matter of time before we start to see others.
Then can you explain a little bit more about the Korean operation here? What 500 startups doing? How many companies have you invested? And what's the most successful one?
Right, so we, similar to Southeast Asia, we started investing in companies in Korea pretty early on, mostly through our global funds. Today we have a dedicated regional fund for Korea and a team that's based here, I think actually at DCamp. So, but we have invested in about 40 companies to date. Probably some of the more well-known Korean companies are OPGG, which is an esports company, Spoon, which actually went through our accelerator program in San Francisco, and then a couple years later, they pivoted into what is now Spoon today. People Fund is another, Dano, and those are probably maybe some of the more well-known companies. But the team is quite active in terms of both investing in companies as well as they run a Series A program, which I think is going on right now, where it's similar to the accelerator, where they have kind of coaching and a cohort, but they're a slightly later stage.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you more about that. So for Bukalapk and Probably many people just think that Bukalapk, if you're just saying that it's an e-commerce company, it's a marketplace, probably people here thinking that, oh, it probably just coupon, you know. So can you explain more about that? What's the major difference between coupon and Bukalapk?
Yeah, I think if we just look from the customer's perspective, where you open Coupang or you open Bukalapak and then you can buy something from it, it is similar. But I think the difference lies in one, in terms of the operation on the ground, right? I think Coupang has more like warehouse and stuff like that, fulfillment and so on, where they try to create like end-to-end. Whereas for Bukalapak, we try to partner with as many partners as possible. So we don't create end-to-end solution by ourselves, but we instead partners with a lot of local logistic partners and obviously the merchants itself. So the goods that are sold in Bukalapak is not located in one area, but instead it's located in the merchant's location in the 17,000 islands where they operate. So that is one. The second, I'm not sure whether Coupang is Coupang has operation in the offline as well, but one thing that we recently conducted is actually for Bukalapak to go offline, partnering with over 1 million offline merchants or retailers to become our partners, so that now people who are online savvy, they can buy Bukalapak application and buy directly from the app. But for people who are not online savvy, they can go into these traditional retailers and order something online there, and then the store owners will essentially taking care of the orders on behalf of the customers. So this is one way that I recently mentioned about tailor to your local market. This is actually our way to address the local situation in Indonesia, where in Indonesia, when we talk about the retailers offline, we are not talking about 7-Eleven or like big chain supermarkets or mini markets. We're talking about millions of these traditional retailers owned by individuals. So we're talking about dealing with millions of CEOs of these small kiosks. So what is the situation in Korea? Obviously, Korean company knows more than Indonesian companies. It might not be the similar or same solution with what we develop in Indonesia, but instead you can develop your solution tailored to the situation or problems in your Korean market.
So I heard that your warung model is very interesting. It's like a mom and pop small stores. You're helping them to grow and digitalize and provide your brand and things like that. It's like making those old stores like the fancy new convenience store like that, right? And I also heard that you're doing something fintech kind of business as well, and providing some loans to the business owner and things like that. Can you explain a little bit about your fintech approach?
Yeah, so again, I try to explain more about the offline retailer situation in Indonesia, because the situation of Indonesia is so challenging with over 17,000 islands. That's why even the big chain of mini market in Indonesia, they only have about 10,000 of stores. It's still only covering a few areas of Indonesia. That is why a lot of people, the entrepreneurial people on rural areas and stuff like that, are seeing this opportunity. They develop their own small, we call it warung, which is mom and pop stores. But because they are traditional retailers, the way they do business is also traditional. They just open the stores, they source goods from local distributor, and they probably don't have a lot of note-taking in terms of the financial reports and stuff like that. And so there is a lot of inefficiency into their operations. So we think that can we help them to improve their efficiencies? One, we create an application for them so that they're now able to order goods or supplies for their stores just by ordering through the applications. So let's say I'm a store owner and I run out of stocks of instant noodle, right? So I just order from application, and then we will deliver the instant noodle, let's say 1 cartons, to their stores. Before, they need to go to the local distributor by themselves, and then buy there, and then pick the infant noodle by themselves, and then deliver by themselves to their stores. So it's inconvenient. The second thing is, because now we are able to fulfill their stores using the app, now the note-taking becomes recorded from applications, right? We know exactly, oh, these stores are actually ordering, let's say, $100 every few days. And then, so we are assuming that the stores are actually making, let's say, $2,000 worth of revenue every month. Now, these data is previously not captured at all, right? If we ask the store owners, what is your revenue? They don't know before. With this, we know. So we are actually able to use that data as a basis for the credit scoring system, right? Meaning that, oh, you know what? These stores are actually making $2,000 and has been consistent for the past 12 months. Maybe we can actually give them a working capital loan for them to be able to grow their business. So that is the concept of the model that we are working on. Now we have disbursed to thousands of these traditional retailers a credit worth in US dollars over $10 million worth of loan.
So it seems that you're entering into the banking area. It's kind of financial kind of sector. So are there any kind of some regulation issues by entering those market?
Yeah, so definitely regulations in the fintech areas are there. So that is why at the moment we choose to partner again instead of instead of dispersing loan from our own balance sheets. So when I say just now that we can use the data for the credit scoring system, the credit scoring system is actually built together between us and our fintech partners who already have the license in dispersing the loan. So we work together by creating the model, but the loan itself is actually originated or come out from our partner's balance sheet.
Okay, so very impressive. So Christine, you've been watching, observing Korean startup ecosystem for a long time, so probably almost 10 years, I believe. So what's your observation and about evaluations about Korean ecosystem comparing to 6 or 7 years ago? And what's the strengths or the weakness of the Korean startup ecosystem, do you think?
I think that there's a lot of very talented people here, and so like when we first started doing investments, even before our Korea Fund existed, it was clear that there's a lot of the right ingredients to eventually develop a strong ecosystem. At the time, it was maybe 2012 or 2013, so still definitely quite early. Today, it's actually evolved very rapidly, which has been quite impressive. And now there's a lot of stakeholders within Korea that all have a very strong interest or urgency to produce a lot more unicorns. And so I think that's been a prevailing theme at this conference and at the previous conferences that I've been at in the past couple of years. And I think to date, I believe there's about 10 unicorns in Korea.
Yeah, 10
and
unicorns.
10 in just 8 years. So that's actually very impressive if you think about just like how quickly that's happened. I think the only thing I would probably caution is that it isn't just kind of unicorns for the sake of unicorns, because sometimes that can produce unhealthy behavior, as we've seen. We've definitely seen this in Silicon Valley, and probably the most biggest example of this currently is WeWork. But I think that as long as there's still a good focus from even the earliest stages on building very sustainable businesses and kind of sound business models, then Korea is going to be very promising just even in the next few years. I think that what we've seen is definitely there's very strong infrastructure, of course, very strong talent, a lot of desire for Korean companies to certainly they oftentimes start with the local market, but they do have aspirations to be global companies, and I think that will definitely come. There's been probably some examples and some where they've been a bit more better suited to either local market or kind of the APAC market or even ASEAN. But we're still very quite bullish on Korea and continue to invest in the market.
Since you're just brought up the WeWork issue, and I like to ask you about your observation, your perspective on the about this kind of bubble thing. Do you think that are we in the bubble? Because a lot of people actually worry about the valuation is kind of too much, is going to burst, and things like that. People worried. And what do you think? I also want to ask you the Fajrin again.
I personally don't think that we're in a bubble similar to the bubbles of the past. To me, a bubble seems like it's very, very unsustainable, and one thing will push things over the edge and everything will fall apart. I think there are certainly examples like WeWork or recent IPOs that have not fared so well. But all in all, there's still quite a lot of capital in the market, and there are actually a lot of very strong, profitable businesses that have gone public, or maybe they're still unicorn status. They haven't gone public yet, and there is still probably broader concerns about a downturn, just because we've been in a bull market for really a long time.
Almost 10 years.
Yeah, if you think about from 2008 to now. So of course, it's always very cyclical. You think, well, how long is this going to last? But I think, from our vantage point, we can only control what we can. But so far, I think that in terms of, is this evaluations are high? I think there's probably still some frothiness. I guess not a bubble, but I'm still quite excited about what the next year or two will bring, or even beyond, in terms of looking at this from a global perspective.
So, Fajrin, what do you think? Are we in the bubble?
Yeah, usually bubble happens when people don't talk about bubble, So when everyone thinks that there is a bubble, then usually there is no bubble. I agree that maybe there is some correction in the market. For example, recently in the last 1 or 2 years, compared to 5 or 6 years ago, when we talked to investors 5 years ago, for example, the investors are always talking about the growth, are always asking about how fast we are growing compared to 1 or 2 years before. But now, when we talk to investors, both existing investors or potential investors, some of them are actually started to ask questions about profitability or path to profitability, meaning that yes, you are growing fast, but how about your revenue? How about your bottom line? And I think in a way it's a healthy reminder for startups. And so this is related to what Christine just now mentioned about unhealthy behavior, right? Because sometimes you want to achieve growth for the sake of growth, or you do anything for that growth, right? By throwing all the subsidies that you can, throwing all the expenses that you can because you have money. It's not healthy, I think. That is why in Bukalapk, for example, we have monitored the KPI, not just the GMV or transactions, but also what we call unsubsidized GMV or transactions, meaning how many of our transaction or GMV are actually coming organically or without the help of any vouchers, subsidy, or cashback or something like that. And in a way, again, we work, yes, maybe there are some investors who pull out from this industry, you know what, I don't want to invest in this industry, I just want to invest in safe thing, for example. But investors who stay, they are selectively looking for startups who, again, don't just grow for the sake of the growth, but also know about path to profitability or sustainability.
Okay, so after my last questions, and I'm going to use up several questions I got from the audience. So my last question for you is that, can you explain a little bit about your Indonesian startup ecosystem? How, I'm kind of wondering whether it's now active. As I mentioned before, I visited, 4 years, to Jakarta, and visited Tokopedia and some other, some companies, not that many investors at the time. And so I'm kind of wondering how many unicorns there, what kind of companies, and things like that.
Yeah, definitely Indonesia and Southeast Asia in general is probably one of the fastest growing market in the world in terms of digital economy, or probably the fastest growing market in the world. And recently there is this study from Google and Temasek saying that the economy is actually growing from right now about 30 billion, if I'm not mistaken, into about 200 billion by 2025. So the growth is there, and a lot of companies are now looking at this market, both from the startup perspective, to enter this market, or from the investor perspective. We have 5 unicorns so far, us, Toolpedia, Gojek, and then Traveloka, which is the online travel, and a payment company called Ovo. Regarding the sectors itself, e-commerce is obviously there, and then we can see that the trend of the field who is reading these industry. So for example, e-commerce is big, and then so if e-commerce is big, then what is industry that can be impacted? One is the payment. That's why one of the unicorns is payment company. And the next thing is probably logistic, right? Because we obviously need logistic company to send the stuff physically, right? So that is one situation. And I want to also comment about the global situation, you know, the US-China trade war. Some people ask, does it impact Indonesia or Southeast Asia in general? It is not an ideal situation, right? US and China fighting, but it is not everything bad, meaning that there are actually some investors from China who previously invested in the US. Now, because of this trade war, they're looking to invest in other countries. And one of the countries that they are looking is actually Southeast Asia. And similarly for the US investors who previously invested in China, now they are looking to invest in other countries, in also Southeast Asia. So, so in fact, I recently actually talked to more Chinese and US investors compared to a few years ago. So this is a sign that this region is actually one of the hottest. And I encourage you, if you want to see the countries outside of the Korea, then definitely Southeast Asia and obviously Indonesia is one of the countries that you might want to look at.
Yeah, South Asian market is already pretty hot among the Korean investors and entrepreneurs. So your investors consist of the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, right? So Korean, who is your Korean investors?
Yeah, we have some Korean investors as well. Naver, and then Mirae Asset, and then last, like few months ago, we just announced Sinhan Bank.
It's amazing that you are able to convince and persuade those foreign investors and make them to invest your company. So, what's the secret sauce? What's the most important thing to convince them to give you the money?
One is obviously help from previous investors, you know. So I mean, like for example, 500 startups, they were told about Bukalapk from our seed investors, right? So one of the things that we look from the investors, also the ability or their network of other investors is one thing that we're looking. But the second is obviously regarding the business performance itself, right? And I mentioned about, you know what, Indonesia, Southeast Asia is definitely one of the hottest countries in the world. And then how do we perform in that market is ultimately what one wanted to attract the investors. But maybe investors' perspective can also explain about it.
So I'm going to use the questions from the audience. So first one is for the Christine. I need to translate. So you're supporting the successful startups actually to grow and get funded more, but obviously there are actually the more startups actually into failures and struggling to survive. And so some people are wondering that is there any kind of support and program to help those struggling startups to get on track, get back to track? Something like that, or successful kind of, some examples. So probably I think that the Supun's case is one of the example.
Yeah, I think in many ways, probably all startups are struggling, like even the ones that seem to be doing well. So when we work with companies, especially through our accelerator, we actually see that as quite a big advantage, that we essentially have 3-4 months of on-site due diligence that most investors will never see, but we do. Even down to the dynamic of the co-founders having issues, like all of those things make a big difference. So, in terms of like, do we have a dedicated program for struggling startups? Nothing like that per se, but when we work with companies, again, even the ones that seem like they're doing great, Fajrin can probably say like they all have problems. So we do try to help companies as much as we can. When they're out of our program, it's probably not quite as structured beyond like we have a very strong network and that they can participate in that doesn't require us. But of course, when companies have challenges or they're not sure where they're going, maybe they're looking to get acquired, we try to help as much as we can. So just today, there's a couple companies that contacted me about this, where they're have been struggling for a while and they're looking to get acquired, and so there's always a lot of that. In terms of what was I think the question was around I forgot the last part. Oh, like if there was
other let me give you other questions.
No.
Yeah, so what do you think about the Korean startups and strengths and the weakness specifically?
I think technically there's probably it's quite strong in terms of like developer talent, and there's a lot of just very smart people that I think we've had the opportunity to work with. In terms of maybe areas of improvement or weaknesses, I think it may be unique to different companies, but there's always a very strong aspiration for a lot of Korean companies to go global. I think that that's probably one area that it would be good to see more of in terms of Korean companies becoming very big global brands. And we've seen it in sectors outside of tech. Like there's many very strong Korean brands that have their global brands, like in consumer electronics, even things like K-pop and K-beauty, like very capable of doing so. And right now I would say there's even much more attention and interest in Korean culture. So I think the same will definitely apply for tech companies coming out.
Okay, question for Fajrin. How about Gojek? It seems that your business is actually part of your business is overlap with Gojek. So how do you think about the Gojek? Are there competitors or your partners and things like that?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this yesterday as well, that going forward, the digital economy is changing very, very fast, and to the point that it is not clear anymore, like what kind of company each company is, right? I mean, like for example, Google. I mean, they were a search engine, but now it's much more than that, right? So it is similar also in the case of Bukalapk and also Gojek, right? We started for Bukalapk as an e-commerce company, but now we started moving to offline, and then we started doing fintech and stuff like that. Gojek started as a ride-hailing company, but then they also moved into logistics services, but now they also offer some kind of like shopping services as well. There's this term that I like, which is a co-opetition, which means cooperation and competitions, meaning that in this blurry world, we can collaborate with anyone and we can compete with anyone. Doesn't mean that if one entity is enemy, doesn't mean that, okay, let's not just do partnership with them. So yes, we are competing with Gojek in one or some areas. For example, recently we are actually expanding into what we call a virtual goods. So you can actually now pay your bills, like electricity bills or water bills or phone bills, into Bukalapk and also Gojek as well. So in that areas, we are competing, we are competitors. But you, as a consumer, when you buy something in Bukalapk, you can choose what logistic companies that you want. Maybe there is this company like Post Indonesia who are offering a regular services delivery, so you can get the goods within a few days. But there is also Gojek there, which can provide same-day delivery. So in that sense, we're actually partnering with Gojek. So we regard Gojek as both friend and enemies, and it is okay. So when we are meeting them, I meet with Gojek CEO or board. I talk about something that we can collaborate, and no need to talk about something that we compete.
Yeah, they're frenemy. So, so now the founder of the Gojek is a minister of the government. So are you able to meet him still?
Yes, I WhatsApp him when he got elected, because again, it's a part of the collaboration as well, right? I mean, as a startup now we are big. One thing that we can collaborate as well is actually with the government. So there is a lot of things that we collaborate with the government. One, obviously, government also wants the SMEs to be flourished. So we do a lot of partnership on how to empower the SMEs in Indonesia. But second, we also now try to offer public services in Bukalapk as well. So now you, if you are Indonesian, you can actually pay tax in Bukalapk because we just partner with Ministry of Finance of Indonesia in that areas.
So question for Christine is about the hardware startups. What's your perspective on investment in hardware startups? And previously you said that 500 doesn't invest a lot in hardware-based startups, which requires great input of the capital. So any advice how to grow and facilitate investment in hardware startups? So I also got these similar questions a lot because there are a lot of some manufacturing hardware startup here, and they're struggling to get funded. So any advice for that?
I actually think there's more, a little bit more appetite nowadays from traditional like software-based investors to invest in hardware. And I think you see that also happening with kind of more deep tech sectors. So biotech or space, aeronautics, biotech, things that probably most of these VCs wouldn't have invested in because everyone is looking now for like what is the next big moonshot industry. They're probably a bit fatigued from, like Uber for X, no offense to Uber, but kind of things that are much more like what is going to be the next, interesting way that someone put it to me was chasing the next storm, not chasing ripples. So if the last few storms were, the internet, cloud, mobile, what's next? And with hardware specifically, there's a lot more crossover now with software in terms of maybe the hardware device is the entry point, but where the company will hopefully actually really develop a more sustainable revenue stream is maybe software subscription. So, so I think that depending on what kind of product it is, if it's something that has a crossover with there's a software component to it, then there's probably more interest from at least the type of VCs that we invest with to invest. There are obviously some investors that are very much focused on hard tech, hardware, medical devices. It's a probably different kind of investor. But hardware is hard. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay, so since we are almost time up, so let me give you my last question each. So there are many, some Korean entrepreneurs or the Korean investors actually having interested in entering, Indonesian market, Southeast Asian market. So they want to make the good investment or also entering the market and start a company there as a Korean entrepreneurs. So do you have some advice for them to working with, Indonesian startup ecosystem? And
I guess understanding about the market is still the key. I repeat this a lot because that is what I think ultimately matters, right? It's not about the technology of the solution, but about how you approach the market. That is why for startups who want to enter Indonesia or any countries, it is very, very important that you either find local partner or local people who understand the market really, really well. And for investors, it's a similar thing. Try to find startups who are actually understanding the local market very, very well. And second, I think the co-opetition thing, meaning that in the future, things will get blurred a lot. So, so in terms of how we view the competition, the ecosystem, we can still collaborate with anyone, I would say. So don't become like a closed ecosystem, like a walled garden where you, oh, I don't want to partner with this, I don't want to partner with that, I don't want to partner with this company. But instead, for every companies out there, try to find a way, try to find a field where you can actually partner with them. I believe that with any companies out there, we can find collaborations. Recently in Indonesia, there is a fear from banking industry, from a bank, regarding the fintech, for example. And I said to them, look, yes, there are things that we are competing, but there are things that, again, we can still collaborate. That's why when we're giving loan to these merchants, we're actually partnering with state-owned banks and many other big banks in Indonesia as well. So collaboration, again, is really, really important going forward.
Yeah, collaboration is key. So my last question to Christine is that although Korean startup ecosystem is booming right now, and also we have 10 Korean unicorn startups, but most of them is actually stuck in the kind of domestic market. Not that many, Korean startup is actually going globals and not that successful. So people kind of wondering, is there a kind of special formula what we have to do go global, more successful? So do you have any advice for that?
I think ultimately, like this largely depends on the type of business you're building. So if it is something that is really designed for the local market, then that's probably a bit more challenging. But I think, as Fajrin pointed out very wisely, collaboration is very big. So, and I would advise the same for U.S. companies that were trying to go into other markets. Like, it's very, very simple. It's too simple to say, I'm just going to localize my website and then go into that market and that's it. There's so much beyond just language. It's also the cultural norms and like what is it that the consumers on the ground need or whatever, if it's consumer or enterprise. So I think as much collaboration you can have with a local partner, it could be an investor, or it could be just having someone local on the ground to help understand how to truly enter a market is key. In terms of Korean companies or Korean founders in general, I mean, nothing that really stands out as like a very serious issue. I think ultimately, again, it comes down to, is this a product that's really tailored for the local Korean market, or is it something that goes beyond that? And are there certain sectors where Koreans actually have an edge compared to any other market? I mean, probably one that immediately comes to mind is probably like esports. That's a global phenomenon. That's where Koreans really have an opportunity to lead and already do in many ways. But even beyond that, I think we were talking, or it was someone else about this company called Blind, which is a Korean company, but it's actually quite popular in the US. And that's like a universal issue. It's not just a Korean issue where people want to vent about their workplace. So I think it's definitely something, certainly in terms of language and being able to speak English, and those are kind of smaller things. But I think ultimately having something that can be a pain point that's solved in other markets, as well as collaboration and finding people who can really help you enter that market, is key.
Yeah, so you're positive about that. So we are going to see more global, startups from Korea as well.
I would think it's only a matter of time. It will happen.
Okay. Okay, thanks for taking your valuable time and share your insight. Please give your hands to both speakers. Thank you very much for listening to that.